Good morning, everybody. My name is Heidi. I'm a chief executive at the Japan Society, and I'm thrilled to see so many of you here on a Saturday morning. And we're thrilled to have Robert Morton here to talk about his forthcoming book and the life of Harry Parkes. I think Robert was saying earlier that the book is coming out in January next year, so do keep a lookout for it. We originally discussed what day to hold this talk, whether it should be today or tomorrow. Robert chose today because Harry would not have approved of a lecture or event on a Sunday. Robert is a professor at Chuo University in Tokyo, so he's joining us this morning from Tokyo. His book on Mitford, one of Harry Parkes' colleagues, the British legation in Tokyo in the late 19th century, came out a few years ago, and Harry Parkes was the obvious follow-on from that. So Robert's going to talk and share his slides to begin with. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much. So Heidi, thank you. I'm so grateful to you for this opportunity. It's so a great honor to talk to the Japan Society, and I'm really delighted to be able to join you today. So when he was appointed as the ambassador to the United Kingdom in 2010, one of the first things that Mr. Hayashi did was a bit strange. He went to visit this church in North London on the right. It's the church where Harry Parkes is buried, and he went to visit the grave of Parkes to pay his respects to, he said, Parkes for his role in promoting industrial development in Japan. I think it's safe to say that a Japanese ambassador will never do this. And not all Japanese were so keen on Parkes by the end of his 18 years in Japan. But he was exceptional in very many respects. And I think Mr. Hayashi was right that he deserves to be remembered. This is a simplified thing of Harry Parkes' career. So he spent his entire career in China and Japan, apart from brief spells in Siam and Korea. I've put the ages at which he gained these positions. As you'll see, they're all, except for the last one, extremely young. So he was an interpreter at the age of 15. He became consul at the age of 25, and then minister or ambassador at the age of 37. That was extremely young. Just to give you a sense of what was more normal, his predecessor and successor as minister to Japan were 49 and 50. So they were the normal ages for that kind of position. 37 was very young. What made him special? There are a few things, I think, but I think the main one was his absolute single-mindedness and determination, which I think you get a little sense of in this photograph. The quote at the top was something that was said about him after he died. I think his friends and his enemies would probably have agreed with this. Never giving in, never allowing himself to be slighted, always resolutely maintaining the dignity and honor of his country. Nearly everybody who made it to minister was from the aristocracy at the time, and few came from a background like this. He was born in a place called Bloxwich near Birmingham, which is in the centre of England. It was an industrial area of factories and coal mines, and it was said that the pollution used to make the sky black during the day. Dickens, on the right, he wrote of how tall chimneys crowding on each other poured out their plague of smoke, obscured the light, and made foul the melancholy air. His father was also called Harry, and he was from a very poor background, but he became a successful businessman, entirely self-made, as his son was. It was a wealthy, God-fearing, hardworking, classic sort of Victorian place to have been born. Unfortunately, By the age of 5, Parks had lost both his parents, his mother to sickness and his father in an accident. As you can see from this gravestone, I've typed out what it says on the gravestone. So you'll see that he left 3 children to deplore their early loss. So that was Parks and his 2 older sisters. So he was an orphan, but his situation was not hopeless. He had relatives who were prepared to take care of him, and there was some money. He also had a powerful mother figure in the person of his eldest sister, Catherine, who was remarkable in her own right. She went to China at the age of 14 to help out at a home for local blind girls in Macau. On the voyage across, she met the missionary and doctor William Lockhart, and she married him when she was 17. Lockhart was truly amazing. Among his many achievements, he started the first hospital in Shanghai for Western-style medicine, and it's still going. It's now called the Renji Hospital, and its website tells us that it treats more than 2 million patients a year. It's a very big hospital. Parks, Lockhart, Harry Parks went to join them. He was 13 when he went to China. And as soon as William Lockhart met him, they instantly bonded. They were friends for life. In 1861, Lockhart said about Parks, "He has been made the instrument of great good to this people. He is truly one to be proud of and to rejoice in." I'm not sure, this was the Chinese people, I'm not sure if all of the Chinese would have quite agreed with that. Another important influence on the young Harry was this man, Charles Gutzlaff, who we could say a lot of things about him. Arthur Waley called him a cross between a parson and a pirate, charlatan and genius, philanthropist and crook. They were tenuously related. Gutzlaff was Parks's father's cousin's husband, and he took on the role of Parks's mentor. It seemed that for Parks to have any kind of future in China, he had to learn Chinese. The trouble with having Gutzlaff as a teacher was that he found languages very easy, and he knew many languages. He was so good at Chinese that people thought that he was Chinese, especially when he was wearing Chinese clothes. Parks just didn't have a gift for languages, and Gutzlaff despaired of him and just thought he wasn't trying hard enough. Making it more difficult for Parks was that he was studying it using these very difficult texts. So these are 2 classic texts in China that have been studied for centuries. It would be like learning English from Shakespeare and the King James Bible. On top of that, Gutzlaff thought he should be learning other languages as well, including this one, which is Manchu. Manchu is almost extinct now, but it was spoken at the emperor's court in China, so was considered important. And Gutzlaff also made him learn Tibetan. He never got anywhere with these languages, but by sheer willpower and determination, he passed the interpreter's exam for Chinese at 15, which meant he could start working as an interpreter. He was entering the service at a good time, as it was expanding dramatically, and they desperately needed interpreters. Following the First Opium War, the Treaty of Nanjing opened 5 ports to Western trade, as well as making Hong Kong a crown colony. Parks would live in all of them except for Ningbo. I've listed them from north to south. I think you can probably see my cursor. So here's Shanghai here. Ningbo is quite close. By the way, Ningbo is the world's busiest port now. There's Fuzhou, he was in there. Xiamen, which they called Amoy, and locals in the city still call Amoy. And then we've got Guangzhou here, what used to be called Canton. We used to call it Canton, and Hong Kong at the bottom. As you'll see, he was moved around quite a bit, especially in the early 1840s. But the one he was in longest was Guangzhou. Westerners have been trading through Guangzhou since the 1680s, but the foreigners have been confined to a tiny strip of land outside the city. Even though the Treaty of Nanjing said that the whole city should be open to Westerners, the Chinese were stopping them leaving this area. As it says, they were called the factories, but this was because they were the residences of factors or traders. Nothing was made in these buildings. The buildings look splendid, but as you can see from the left, the plan on the left, they were extremely squashed together. As Parkes put it, the confinement will always make a residence there irksome and wearisome. The feeling of confinement was also heightened by the fact that there were very few Western women there. Indeed, there were very few in China. It was common for men there to have Chinese mistresses, but Parkes was from a strict, he was a strict evangelical, low church Protestant, and it was absolutely out of the question for him to do anything of the kind. So he was very fortunate to meet a beautiful, eligible woman who didn't mind the thought of living in China on a fairly brief trip back to England in 1855. He met her less than 2 months before he had to go back. So it had to be a very quickly arranged business. Fortunately, it was love at first sight. A friend recorded that Fanny, in other cases, had been hard to please, critical, sensitive, reserved. Yet, in a few hours on that day, it seemed as if her heart opened and let the stranger freely in. The surrender on the other side was no less rapid and complete, and their friends had to be startled and a little critical over the hasty lovemaking. The 23-year-old Fanny was from a posh family. Her grandfather, Sir Thomas Plumer, had been Master of the Rolls, and his widow still lived in this house called Cannons in Stanmore, which is now an outer suburb of London. The rest of the family lived in a lodge in the grounds. Parkes was well below her in the social rankings of the time, but it seems that the family really took to him, or at least Lady Plumer did. So Lady Plumer told him, "It is a subject of fragrant regret the time was only allowed to us to discover the inestimable value of such an acquisition to every member of the family circle when we were called upon to part with it." So Harry and Fanny were married on the 1st of January 1855. Hard to say how happy the marriage was. There was plenty of heartache, and such a driven, short-tempered, single-minded man cannot have been easy to live with. But on her deathbed, Fanny said, "I have the very best and most unselfish husband, the best man I have ever seen, and I feel so thankful to God for having given me such a man for my husband." I think it was fundamentally a good marriage, and they had 5 daughters and 2 sons. Soon after his return to China, Parkes, now acting consul in Guangzhou, had the British master of a junk run into his office. His boat, the Arrow, had been boarded by some Chinese officials suspecting the crew of piracy. Its crew had been arrested and its Union Jack hauled down. Parkes went to the junk and told the officials that the treaty said the crew had to be taken to the British consulate. They laughed at him, saying they knew nothing about any treaty and that they had orders to take the men away. The argument got heated and one of them struck Parkes. This trivial dispute gradually escalated bit by bit, and it turned into the Second Opium War. There was a big time lag between things happening in Japan and London finding out about it. It took about 2 months for news to get from China to London. But when it did, the Prime Minister felt that he decided to support the military action on the grounds that the Chinese officials had acted illegally and there had been no apology from the authorities for what they had done. Here we see what the Foreign Secretary said. The principle involved in this case is most important, and the demands made by Mr. Consul Parkes appear to me to be very moderate under the circumstances. However, the starting of a war on such thin grounds outraged most of the House of Commons. William Gladstone said, and it's written at the top, a consul, so it's only a consul, Parkes, so not even a minister, and actually Parkes was only an acting consul, is forsooth to be at liberty to direct the whole might of England against the lives of a defenseless people. The government was defeated, and Punch gave its little report of the vote. So those that had voted against the government were for hauling down the British flag and apologising to the Chinese. Those that had supported the government were for maintaining the honour of England. There was a Chinese majority of 16, so there was a majority of 16 against the government. So the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, had to either resign or call an election. So he decided to call an election, and it turned out to be a wise thing to do because he won a massive majority. He got 65% of the popular vote. To Parkes, it seemed like a tremendous vindication. Parkes wrote, "The finger of one who rules the destinies of races is clearly traceable in the whole affair. It is the cause of the West against the East, of paganism against Christianity." It was, of course, also a vindication for Lord Palmerston, who had always advocated a firm policy against China. We don't have time to discuss the ins and outs of the Second Opium War. I'll just talk about how it affected Parkes. So at this point, Parkes has become a household name in Britain. He's very famous for having started the war. But his reputation has been fatally damaged by the look of things. Even though the government was supporting the war, they believed that Parkes had acted very irresponsibly. However, Parkes's reputation recovered when later in the war, he was in a group that was captured by the Chinese. It was a situation which, with his fearlessness and fortitude, brought out the very best in him. He behaved with exceptional courage during a terrifying ordeal, refusing to cut any kind of deal for his release and refusing to leave unless his comrade was freed with him. The fate of the prisoners in China became a major story in Britain. The Foreign Secretary said that he had never known in all his experience such excitement and interest as was felt about their captivity, and people thought and spoke of nothing else. Parkes became imprinted in the public mind as an authentic Victorian hero. As his future interpreter in Japan put it, he was invested with the prestige of a man who would look death in the face with no ordinary heroism, and in the eyes of all European residents in the Far East, held a higher position than any other officer of the Crown. The British minister in China, Lord Elgin, decided that the prisoners' capture in violation of Western rules of war, and their brutal treatment had to be punished. And he thought that the best way to hurt the emperor, but not ordinary Chinese people who were completely blameless, was to destroy his summer palace. Chinese resentment at this continues to bedevil Britain's relations with the country. I'm going to show you an excerpt from a Chinese film with a Chinese actor playing Parkes. This scene reflects the official Chinese line that the destruction of the palace was made to cover up the fact that Britain and France wanted to plunder its treasures. No mention is made of the prisoners.
而今爵士有几句话，请你们转告恭亲王爷，转告大清国的大皇帝，我要烧毁他的行宫，举世闻名的万源之源的圆明园。
强盗要杀人放火，借口是主人不许他进屋来偷盗，真是荒谬绝伦。 还要恬不知耻的大声宣告，为什么？为什么他们竟敢这样横行霸道？就因为中国有辽阔的土地，有金银财宝，他们也有，他们有的是野心和洋枪大炮。
This scene is pure fiction. Parkes had nothing to do with the burning of the Summer Palace. And it's also not true. It's not true that the main motivation for the destruction was plunder. But it is true that its treasures were looted, and many of them are still in Western collections, including in the British Royal Collection, in spite of Chinese demands for their return. Parkes's high reputation saw him 5 years later being promoted to be British minister to Japan. This is how Japan Punch saw him on his arrival, a mosquito sent by the British government to torment the potentates of the Far East. The Japan that Parkes was moving to was exceptionally volatile. It was coming to the end of the Shoguns era, and the nation was unstable and every bit as dangerous as China had been. But Parkes did not worry about such things. As my friend A.B. Mitford put it, where his own life was concerned, he was always as big a gambler as the ace of spades. I've calculated that there are at least 12 times when he could easily have died in China and Japan, and yet he was never so much as scratched. It is not surprising that he saw himself as being under special divine care. In 1865, he wrote that God has so signally watched over me and protected me. The Shogun's capital of Edo, which became Tokyo, was particularly dangerous, and Parkes's predecessors, who were not as sure as him of divine protection, had retreated to the nearby port of Yokohama. Yokohama was surrounded by water, so it was possible to control who entered, so it was a good deal safer than Edo. But Parkes believed that the British minister had to insist on being in the Shogun's capital of Edo. So they ended up in exceptionally uncomfortable accommodation there. Parkes never complained about discomfort, but even he thought it was bad. He said it was very like penitentiary life. Mitford said that he thought it would be, during the winter, that it would be more comfortable sleeping outside because then at least you wouldn't get the drafts. As can be seen at the bottom though, it had a very high fence, so it was secure, and that was the thing that mattered most. But even Parks had to admit that Yokohama was a lot more comfortable, and the legation, so what we now call the embassy, basically moved back there in 1867, with Parks living in this place until he went on leave in 1871, after which they moved to the site that the embassy currently occupies in Tokyo. Japan had two sources of power, the emperor in Kyoto and the shogun in Edo. The shoguns had ruled unchallenged since the beginning of the 1600s, but in recent years, the institution had been weakened by its failure to confront the challenge from the forced entry of the Western powers into Japan. As the shogun weakened, Emperor Komei was determined to fill the power vacuum. He was a die-hard xenophobe, absolutely determined to do everything he could to get the foreigners out. Here we see a letter that he addressed to Iemochi. He said, "We are subjected to the insults of 5 arrogant powers. Conquest by them seems certain to be our fate. Thinking of this, I can neither sleep nor swallow food. The subjugation of the hated foreigner is the greatest of the national tasks that faces us." Unfortunately, the shogun, who was only 17, he was powerless to get rid of the foreigners. And in fact, the threat from foreigners seemed to get worse. So in the 1850s, the Western powers had agreed treaties with Japan to open up ports to Western trade. But those treaties had never been ratified by the emperor. So Parks decided that this had to happen. So the way he did it was that he coordinated with the other powers, and together they put together a big flotilla of ships to go down to Kobe, which was the nearest port to Kyoto, to force the emperor to ratify the treaties. The emperor was livid, but he caved in because the horrific events in China had shown him what might happen to him if he resisted. The situation greatly changed with the deaths of both the emperor and the shogun within 6 months of each other. The emperors at the age of 36 being in very suspicious circumstances. The Komei was succeeded by his son, the 14-year-old Emperor Meiji, and Iemochi was succeeded by Tokugawa Yoshinobu on the right. So, because Yoshinobu was an adult and he was very capable, power naturally swung back to the shogunate. Yoshinobu decided that Japan needed to reach an accommodation with the Western powers, and he launched a charm offensive which even won over Parks. After a meeting between them in 1867, Parks reported that he was the most superior Japanese he had ever met, and that he felt quite disposed to give him all the support he could. However, at the beginning of 1868, there was a coup in Kyoto when an alliance of disgruntled feudal lords, in combination with court nobles, seized control of the palace and therefore the emperor, who issued a decree proclaiming the end of the shogunate. Yoshinobu was just down the road in Nijo Castle, but he could not countenance fighting in the sacred city of Kyoto and possibly involving the emperor in the fighting. So he moved to his stronghold of Osaka. At this point, the shogun had far more forces at his disposal than the emperor. But in the crucial battle of Toba Fushimi, the shogun's forces, which are on the left, and the emperor's forces on the right, they met on this bridge. You'll see that the shogun had 3 times the forces of the emperor, but it was the emperor's forces that won the battle. The fighting, it then developed into a civil war called the Boshin War, which would continue into the following year. So it was still unclear of who would win, but Parkes quickly gave up on the shogun and decided to indicate his support for the emperor. He was right. It was the emperor's forces that did win in the end. And he read this situation very skillfully. He managed to position himself as the new regime's best friend without completely committing himself. How did he do it? Much of it was down to the intelligence he received from his interpreter, Ernest Sato, this man, who had outstanding Japanese, and he had a lot of contacts with important Japanese people. He was extremely well informed. So Sato and Parkes did not like each other. Sato wrote later, "From the beginning, we were never friends." But Sato was crucial to Parkes' ability to respond to fast-moving events. Years later in his memoir, Sato proudly wrote, "We had felt the pulse of the Japanese people more carefully and diagnosed the political condition better than our rivals, so that the prestige of the British minister in the years 1868 and 1869 was completely in the ascendant." Parkes quickly formed relationships with the new Japanese ministers. This one, Iwakura Tomomi, was the one that he respected the most, writing that he was clearly possessed of great ability. The two of them basically got along, but Parkes would have these terrible outbursts of temper when he didn't get his way. And Iwakura told Sato that his violent demeanor often damaged the effect of the sincere and friendly advice he offered to them. There are many stories of his explosions of temper, such as the furious smashing of a glass to show how Japan could be dashed to pieces. In 1869, at an imperial audience, the emperor delivered a short message expressing his hope that Queen Victoria was in good health. When Parkes realized that the Queen had been given a lesser title than the emperor, he stunned everybody by telling the emperor, "Until you cease to refer to Queen Victoria as Teo, as you have just done in your message, and until you substitute the title Korte for Teo, you will be guilty of disrespect towards my sovereign," whereupon he walked out. An issue which really set him off was Christianity in Japan. It was illegal, and being a Christian was punishable by death. However, some French missionaries discovered some hidden Christians and encouraged them to come out of the woodwork. The government decided to crack down and put up these signs. So on the right is a translation of this sign. Parkes managed to get them to stop calling Christianity a heretical sect, but he couldn't get them to stop persecution. It wasn't any of Britain's business what the Japanese decided for its own people, but this was obviously an issue which touched them very deeply. Of course, Parkes personally as well. However, the Foreign Secretary at the time, Lord Stanley, was not very religious, and he just instructed Parkes to, as we can read at the top, simply press in a friendly way on the Japanese government the expediency of forbearance in matters of religion. However, Parkes' idea of friendly was very different to Lord Stanley's. The poor minister, Japanese minister, who had to deal with him was this man here on the left, Okuma Shigenobu, who actually went on to become the Prime Minister of Japan. So here's part of Parks's harangue to Okuma. "You are cowardly. Why not destroy evil customs and come out into a broader world than you have yet known? Christianity is now accepted by all civilized countries. Its excellence and truth are evident. Nothing is worse than to regard as an enemy what the whole world knows to be good. Nothing is so foolish as to reject the truth. You ought to open your eyes. It is truly said that Oriental officials are so in the habit of looking only at what is directly before them that they never turn their gaze upwards." Parks had more positive interactions with his Japanese counterparts over the modernization of the country. The emperor's ministers were well aware of how weak and behind Japan was compared to the West, and knew that the nation needed help to develop. Japan's communications were particularly bad. It was mountainous, it had almost no navigable rivers, and many of its roads were not suitable for horses. So people walked, which meant, as Parks said, places that were separated by 400 or 500 miles were nearly a month apart. The feudal lords would travel such distances in enormously long processions like this one. As Parks put it, it is essential to the establishment of a vigorous and compact administration and of equal importance to the interests of commerce that improved means of communication should be provided. And we can see some of them here. So he played an essential role in arranging the financing and the technical know-how to build railways. So here in the middle, you can see this railway. This was the first railway in Japan. It actually opened in 1872. And you can also see a very nice lighthouse. So he was instrumental in the building of a large number of lighthouses around Japan to make the seas around Japan safe. These were very important developments for Japan. So in spite of the fights, the Japanese were really very grateful to Parks. And when he went home on leave in 1871, the emperor gave him this magnificent sword as a gift. It's now in the V&A Museum in London, accompanied by a message from his principal minister to the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone. Our government has trusted profoundly to him as a support and have frequently received his aid in different matters with various nations, and it is truly impossible to express our sense of gratitude. At this point, Parks was probably at the very height of his power and reputation. But as the years went by, negative views of Parks became more common. Here are three of Parks's most virulent critics. So the one on the left, Sir John Pope Hennessy, he described to Gladstone how Parks had this bullying and acrid policy. The one in the middle, Sir Edward Reed, complained about how the European powers had been seriously detrimental to Japan, and England was the greatest sinner. The most virulent of all was the one on the right, Edward House. So writing in 1876, he wrote, "We have bombarded their towns and forced ourselves and our trade upon them without consideration for anything but our own interests. The Japanese are courteous and highly sensitive, and yet our diplomacy continues to treat them as quasi-barbarians. You unnecessarily wound their national pride by small indignities. You make a treaty with them at the cannon's mouth which everyone knows to be entirely in your own interest, and which totally ignores the right which every nation should possess of regulating its own import and export duties. Parkes had family worries at this time, with Fanny suffering from depression and in fact contemplating suicide. They decided that she had to return to Britain with their children in 1878. In October 1879, Parkes received a telegraph message saying that she was very seriously ill. He dropped everything and went back as quickly as he could, although Fanny didn't want him to, saying, "I have always striven to set him free as much as I could for public business, and now I am the cause of bringing him home at the greatest inconvenience." Unfortunately, he reached London 4 days after she died, at the age of 47. She was buried in St. Lawrence's graveyard, and this plaque was put up in the church. The inscription gives us a sense of how Parkes saw her, particularly the line, I'll just show it on the cursor, I think. Can I? Yes. Particularly this line, who after long devotion to responsible duties in China and Japan. So he saw her work as being important. He treated her as an essential part of his professional life, very unusual for a Victorian, rather than simply as an ornament to him. Parkes still had godlike status among the foreign residents in Japan, but the shine had come off it as far as the Japanese was concerned. 18 years was too long for him to be in Japan, but it was out of the question to dismiss or demote him, and there wasn't really anywhere else he could be put except China. And there were concerns that his past dealings with China would make him very unwelcome there. Anyway, when the position of Minister to China came open in 1883, he was given it. I think quite a lot of people would have been glad to see him leave, but he was paid every honor by the emperor, and he even got this very sympathetic cartoon in Japan Punch. He was not welcomed with open arms in China, but they did not refuse to accept him as minister. As it turned out, it didn't matter very much because he was only there for a year and a half. Here he is with his beloved eldest daughters, Minnie and Mabel, in Beijing, with a slightly unkind comment from Robert Hart above. They managed to mellow him, and for the first time, we see him laughing at himself a little bit and finding the funny side of situations. They really hit the tone of his letters really does change. But inevitably, they both got married and left him. He'd never really cultivated friendships because work and his family had been his entire life. So when they did leave, he was very much alone. In March 1885, he caught a fever, as he had done many times in the past. But this time, exhaustion and a long list of ailments, and I think maybe the absence of someone he loved, made him unable to fight it off. He was 57. The tributes flowed in after he died. Ernest Sato said, without any doubt, he achieved more than any other half dozen put together of the men who have represented England in that part of the world. A good amount of money was raised in Britain, Japan, and China for memorials to him. On the right is a bust in St. Paul's Cathedral, and on the left is a statue of him that was put up in Shanghai. It was unveiled by the Duke of Connaught, Queen Victoria's third son, who I think really did go over the top when he said, we cannot forget that it was largely owing to him that Japan has now advanced so greatly in civilization. it was in a very prominent position on the Bund. I think you can just see the river behind. But it was taken down in 1942 during the Japanese occupation. The one in St. Paul's, though, is still there. Parkes is hardly Mr. Politically Correct nowadays, but his bust is not on the list of monuments and statues that Topple racists have said should be taken down. So he seems to be safe there for the moment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. That was a fantastic overview of Parkes and his life. I can see people clapping. We haven't got microphones off, so you can't hear the response. We've now got a little bit of time for anybody's questions. If you're in the audience and wish to ask a question, you have the option to unmute yourself and speak, or if you prefer, you can put your question in the chat. And I think there's already been a little bit of discussion about cannons in the chat. But picking up on a question posted earlier by Paul Diamond in the chat, Hugh Cortazzi concluded that Parkes didn't neglect British commercial interest in Japan. What evidence is there on what he did to support this?
Parkes was accused of being far too partisan about this and worrying far too much about British interests and not enough about Japan. So one thing in particular was the tariff. So Parkes insisted that the tariff must only be 5% on imports. So this was extremely low. And because Japan had very little in the way of tax raising powers, tariffs were a very important source of income. So keeping it at 5% really did hurt the government. And the Japanese government did want to increase it, but Parkes didn't allow it. So maybe that's just one example of how Parkes was very interested in British trade. He was also very interested in promoting British engineers and British expertise. He wanted Britain to be involved in the industrialization of Japan, and also British Army trained the Japanese Army, and they got Navy people to train the Japanese Navy. So he wanted British trade and British influence to be as strong as possible. I can't hear you, Heidi.
I was muted, sorry. Thank you very much. Paul, does that answer your question, or do you want to follow up on that at all?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Robert, for your answer. Excellent, and look forward to reading your great book. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And another question in the chat from Amandine Martin saying, thank you for the presentation, and suggesting that the place, the block switch where Harry was raised, which was very industrial, was certainly contrast with what he would have seen in Japan. And is there any record of Harry Parkes's impressions on the Japanese landscape, comparing it to his birthplace?
Parkes was interesting in that he was very taken with natural beauty, but not with man-made beauty. He never commented on buildings or paintings. He was not at all interested in Chinese arts, but he loved mountains. And actually his favorite mountains were the Alps. He climbed Mont Blanc, which was quite an achievement in those days. And he also climbed Mount Fuji, and his wife was the first woman to climb Mount Fuji because there was a taboo on women climbing it. He loved nature, he loved mountain climbing. He was particularly taken with Chinese nature, but I think, and Chinese scenery, but I think that was because he was younger when he was in China. By the time he was in Japan, he'd sort of, he got used to what the scenery looked like. We never see him making a comment, for example, on how beautiful Mount Fuji is.
Thank you. Yuichiro, you have your hand raised. Do you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you. Thanks very much for that most illuminating talk. You mentioned, or there was a reference to the 5 big powers.
Yes.
In your assessment, how did Parkes compare with the other 4 their representatives in Japan at the time. Was he the was he the preeminent representative of a Western nation?
Yes, he was. It's partly because of things that were going on in those places. So in America, there was the Civil War in the 1860s, which very much distracted American attention. So although America was involved in the initial opening of Japan, America was very much in the background until we get well into the 1870s. France was the main rival, and it was a major rival because the French minister was very, very aggressive at trying to promote French interests. So, for example, he managed to negotiate the French to build the first naval dockyard in Japan, in Yokosuka. But of course, there was the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871. And so then the French were out. Parkes was very much the top dog. It's only really towards the end of his time, America recovers from the Civil War, and Germany starts to become powerful because there's the unification of Germany in 1871, and so Germany becomes a big player. So by the end of his time, there's more competition, but in the 1860s, first half of the 1870s, he's most certainly top dog.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat. I mean, you don't have to put your questions in the chat. Do feel free to speak them. It makes a change from my voice. But Michael Trull is asking about your opinions of Parkes's relationship with other chargés d'affaires, people like Charles Winchester, Dr. Charles Winchester, F.O. Adams, and Robert Watson, and whether you had any thoughts about his relationship with these people.
Parkes tended to be quite proper in his professional relationships. But what happened was that when he went on leave in 1871, he didn't so I think Watson took over and then Adams took over from Watson. So there were two chargés d'affaires during that time. And Parkes often very much disagreed with what they said. So I think it was Watson who said that Britain no longer needed a garrison in Japan. Britain had around 500 soldiers protecting the minister and protecting British interests. And Watson decided, well, we don't need that anymore. And Parkes was saying we most certainly do. And also there were arguments about the building of the new legation, which is now the embassy in Tokyo. So Parkes was very much someone who didn't talk about personalities. So he was very much concerned with business. So we don't really know what he thought about his colleagues in Japan. I've never seen a negative thing that Parkes wrote about Sato. There's lots of negative things that Sato wrote about Parkes. So Parkes just didn't talk about personal things. So it's really only when he goes, when he's in England on leave, that we see big disagreements between Parkes and the chargés d'affaires, so Watson and Adams.
Robert, first of all, thank you for a really excellent talk. Greatly enjoyed it. My question is simply, how widely did Harry Parkes travel in Japan during his time there? And did he get to know sort of senior daimyo? How widely did he meet with senior figures outside Edo?
The answer is a lot. Parkes was very restless. And he was always sort of planning to go somewhere, particularly when Edo was or Tokyo was unbearably hot in the summer. He'd always be planning to go off somewhere. He wasn't a particularly good sailor, actually, but he never let that stop him. So he went all over Japan, all over Kyushu, up to Hokkaido. He would take overland trips. one remarkable trip he took with his wife was from Kyoto to the Sea of Japan coast port of Tsuruga, which was a sort of very difficult journey. It took a week. He had to get there and get back. It was all probably on foot, or a lot of it would have been on foot. And it was just to see whether Tsuruga was appropriate as a West Coast port, and he decided it wasn't. So it seemed like a waste. He did meet Daimyo. His problem was that Daimyo didn't very often want to meet him. He did meet the Daimyo of Satsuma, and he didn't, when he went up to Kaga, so that's up around Kanazawa, the Daimyo refused to meet him. I think the Daimyo on the West Coast, I don't think he met any of them. They just refused to meet him. There were just too many problems with getting involved with him. So he did meet Uwajima, who became quite important. So he met one or two, but it wasn't through any lack of effort from him. It was more on the Japanese side that they decided that they were indisposed, they were sick, something was wrong, and they couldn't see him.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Robert, thank you so much for the talk, and wonderful illustration too. Illustrations fascinating. Can I ask you for a biographer's view of Parks's personality? Because he gets a rough press from history, because he was clearly a very difficult man to work for, and he was tough and bad-tempered. And yet, reading Sato's papers, reading Sato's diaries at the period, one comes across slightly unusual attitudes from Parks. For example, on the death penalty, there is an instance where he argues against the death penalty as a punishment for Japanese who have attacked foreigners, which you don't expect to find from a conventional Victorian imperialist. And in your talk, you brought out some of the more affecting personal feelings from Parks. I wondered if you'd give us a view about him as a man.
Thank you very much, David. Yeah, you're right. He can be quite surprising. So, I mean, he was a liberal. He supported the Liberal Party, which one wouldn't really have thought from someone like him. I think he changed during his life. He was described as an alpha male in China, and certainly his role in starting the Second Opium War was very much him, the aggressive imperialist type. But then I think after that, he became a lot more cautious. He said, I can't be responsible for starting 2 wars in China. And he knew that he could never start a war in Japan. So it was all complete bluff. His pressure on Emperor Komei was just absolute bluff. He just couldn't do it. So I think that his stay in Japan, he was very much focused on peace. He was very much keeping the peace. There were moments when he could have, he could have resorted to force, and he never did. He never did in Japan. So I think he calmed down a lot in terms of policy, but he was certainly a very highly strung person. He said of himself that he just couldn't take things calmly, and that it brought him misery. He thought that his own personality was very difficult to live with. He found himself difficult to live with. I think that he was loved by his family. He was certainly his daughters were very devoted to him. Those eldest daughters were very devoted to him, and he was very devoted to them. So I think they sort of saw through it. I think they probably saw him as, in a sense, being a victim of himself, that he just couldn't help himself. I think that he was very directed by his divine mission. He says at one point that he believes that that God is directing his actions. God is directing his behavior, and so he sees his service as being divine service. So I think that was a very powerful motivator for him, much more so than the other, most of the others, the other people who we think about in Japan at the time. They weren't so firmly directed in that way as Parks was. Is that any help?
Very much so, if I can just say, and that may be one reason for the conflict with Sato meant it, because I mean we're talking about an aggressively Christian man in the form of Parks, and a man like Sato, who at that stage in his life had essentially rejected religion, and as he described himself later, was an egotist and an infidel, and they were different characters, different personalities. So you can see how this was not a marriage made in heaven.
No, but I think the reason that they didn't get along was because I think Sato found it impossible to hide how horrified he was when Parks would let rip at a senior Japanese minister who clearly deserved some respect. But I mean, he really throw objects around. He was accused of knocking one to the ground. We don't know if that actually happened. It probably didn't, but he was certainly accused of it. And I think Sato winced when he saw those things. I think he found it hard to translate horribly insulting comments from Parks. And I suspect that Parks noticed that and didn't think it was appropriate for his interpreter to disapprove of him.
Thank you, Robert. Questions are still coming in. We'll let you leave shortly, but if we can encroach a bit further on your evening.
Very happy.
Have a question from Norio Suzuki and a follow-up from Leslie Downer. So Norio is asking about Parks's impact on the move of the power from the shogun to the Choshu Satsuma, forming the new government, and a book he'd read which says that Parks helped that enormously. And Leslie is asking about Parks's role in insisting that Van Valkenburg, possibly the American consul, handing over a Stonewall Jackson purchased by the shogun, and that also to the Choshu side, and that also helped to ensure the defeat of the Tokugawa Republic in Ezo, and whether that, what's your view of both of these things?
Well, I think Parks managed it very shrewdly indeed. Because his argument, so the way he sort of showed his support for the emperor, and it was very early, it was in May 1868. So I think at that point, the imperial forces weren't even in control of Edo, I think. I'm not quite sure about that. But anyway, I mean, things were very much still in the balance. He had his credentials rewritten. So the credentials had always been addressed to the shogun, but he had them rewritten to be addressed to the emperor himself. And so he was able to say, well, look, I mean, clearly the emperor is the head of state of Japan, and it was inappropriate to address them to the shogun. But the message behind that was that he saw the emperor and the emperor's ministers as being the future of Japan. But he didn't do it in such a way as to make it so that if the emperor's forces had been defeated, he wouldn't have been able to come back afterwards and say, well, I was just following proper European practice. So I think that it was extraordinarily well managed. It was an extraordinarily difficult time. And we might contrast him with Van Valkenburg. So Van Valkenburg was really, he really handled it very poorly, because he was very hostile to the new regime, the new emperor's, the Meiji regime, when he didn't have to be. So what had happened, this ship, the shoguns, the shogun had ordered this ship from America, this warship from America, and it had been delivered, and the Western powers had decided that they should be neutral in the Civil War, but the Civil War had carried on, and it had the Emperor's forces were completely in control of all of Japan except for Hokkaido, which is the northern island, and so Parks was saying, well, clearly. They are the government of Japan. They're the government of almost all of Japan. This is ridiculous to keep up this thing. Oh, we have to be neutral in the conflict. And so he pushed very hard for the other powers to get rid of neutrality. So once they got rid of neutrality, then the Americans could hand over the Stonewall Jackson. So it does seem very strange that particularly Van Valkenburg was so slow to do that, I think.
Okay, I think we've probably wrapped up most of the questions. There's just one quick question from Roger Macy about his religious beliefs. You mentioned he was an evangelical. Was he C of E or nonconformist? What particular flavour was he?
I don't actually know that. I don't know that. I mean, he certainly supported. I mean, the thing is, there wasn't an awful lot of choice in China and Japan about where you worshipped. I mean, he certainly was very generous. He was C of E, I think. He was C of E, but he was very devout. I mean, they would have prayers every morning at breakfast. I think probably before breakfast, his whole family would have prayers every morning. But I think he was, yes, he was Church of England, because I know that because when he went on leave, when he went to England, he worshipped at Church of England churches. So I think if there was a Church of England church available and it was low, it was evangelical, that was what he wanted.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And sorry, and having said that with all the questions, you've got one more I'll quickly try and throw that in. From Ellie Burkett about the collection of Japanese paper and paper artifacts called the Parks Collection at the V&A, which was requested, she thinks, by Gladstone, and it doesn't seem to fit with the picture of his character. And do you know anything about this? Can you provide information?
Yeah, actually, I used to think it was Gladstone, and then I read it was Lord John Russell, or he might have been Earl Russell at the time. I can't quite remember, but it wasn't in the end Gladstone. It was Russell, and it was to do with the possibility that Japanese paper could be they could get ideas for manufacturing such paper in Britain, and that could be a new kind of business. So it wasn't. I don't think it was really a sort of academic interest. It was a serious. It was a business possibility, I think. But Parks was, if you gave Parks a job like that, he would do it to the absolute nth degree, or he would make his staff do it. He did have outstanding staff, and anything like that, they did outstandingly well. And the Parks collection, it was actually exhibited in Japan. It's one of the best collections of 19th century Japanese paper anywhere, including Japan.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I'm going to put us back onto gallery view. I don't know whether it works for everybody else, but and encourage people to unmute themselves so that we can applaud you. And thank you very much indeed for sharing your insights and so much wonderful information about the life of somebody who is clearly a remarkable man, and somebody of whom you obviously have a lot of affection. So Robert, thank you very much for giving us your evening and for sharing the story with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you for listening. Thank you.
And